what spirit should guide you as you move ahead? And you might say, well, I don't need it. Might be your stomach. You might be a worshiper of the god Priapus, right? He's the god of giant erections. That's what happens if your whole identity is staked on your sexuality. It's like some spirit is going to guide you. That's life. The question is, what is the highest spirit that could guide you? So in the Exodus story, the proposition of the story is the highest spirit that could guide you is the spirit that objects to tyranny and that calls the enslaved to freedom. And that's the representation of God in Exodus. So that's what God is in the Exodus story. Now that's not all that God is in the biblical stories, but that's God in the Exodus story. And so that is the God that, if you abide by that God, then you believe that tyranny is implicitly wrong, even if you tyrannize yourself, and that there's something implicitly virtuous about striving for freedom, especially if you're enslaved. So anyways, that's the voice that speaks to Moses. And the voice tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh, the tyrant, to let his people go. That's that famous line, let my people go. But the line is actually, let my people go so that they may worship me in the desert. Okay, so anyways, God through Moses calls the Israelites out of tyranny and he punishes the tyrant. And so if you believe that fate punishes tyrants, you're already immersed in the Exodus story to some degree. If you believe that tyranny is implicitly wrong, of course most Americans believe that. Okay, so now the Israelites leave the tyranny. You'd think, hey man, great, freedom, because now you're out of the tyranny. But that isn't how life works. This is why people won't drop their tyrannical presuppositions, because you go out of the tyranny into the desert, not to the promised land. Desert first. And what's the desert? Everyone's lost. No one knows which way to go. Everyone fights. Everyone turns to the worship of false idols. Everyone wants the tyrant to reassert himself. That's the situation we're in the aftermath of the death of God in the West. And so that's really useful to know, because one of the things you might want to know in your life is, why do people cling to their own tyrannical presuppositions? And the answer is, well, at least they're orienting structures, pathological as they might be. If you drop them, you're not redeemed, you're just lost. And the idea that being lost is freedom, that's a preposterous idea. No one lost is free. They're just enveloped in chaos. Okay, so what happens in the Exodus story is, now the Israelites are out in the desert, wandering around for like generations, and they get all fractious and fight and bitch and complain and start worshiping false idols, and they're scrapping with each other. And that's because they have the habits of slaves. They don't know how to govern themselves. And so they ask Moses to sit as a judge. And so he does. For the story's very unclear about this, but for a long time, years and years, morning, dawn till midnight, he's judging the Israelites like mad and adjudicating their squabbles. And imagine what he's doing, eh? If you had to make peace between 1,000 people who were squabbling with their wife or their friends or their enemies, you have to render judgment on that. And for judgment to work, the people who are judged have to see the judgment as just, because otherwise you have to impose it by force. Right? So if I hear you arguing with someone and I try to mediate, I have to come up with a solution that you'll both accept. That means I have to extract out of that chaos some principle of order. Imagine you do that 1,000 times or 5,000 times. So now you start to understand the nature of the principles of order. Okay, so now two things happen. Jethro, who's Moses' father-in-law, comes along. He's a Midianite, a foreigner, and he says, you got to stop doing this. You can't sit as judge on the Israelites. There are two reasons. They need the responsibility, and you shouldn't turn yourself into another Pharaoh. So if you take all the responsibility onto yourself, you become a tyrant, and the Israelites stay slaves. So he says to Jethro, this is a signal moment in the development of Western culture, by the way. He says, you take the Israelites, you divide them into groups of 10, and you have each of the 10 elect an elder, and then you take the groups of elders, and you have them elect a meta-elder, and you do that all the way up to 10,000s. And then you have the judgments that are necessary rendered at the lowest level of the hierarchy possible. So, if I'm arguing with you, first we go to our elder. And then if the elder can't figure it out, he gets the elders together and maybe they render judgment. If they can't, it goes to the council of elders and all the way up. And if it isn't mediated by the time you have the groupings of 10,000, then Moses gets to weigh in. And that's called subsidiarity. And the idea is you have to produce a hierarchy of responsibility, distributed responsibility, as an antithesis to tyranny and to the desert. And that's the model for good governance. And that's symbolically equivalent to Mount Sinai. And it's also the model of the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. So Jonathan Pageau did a lovely job of explaining that in this. And so part of the model that we're trying to put forward in this group that I'm describing is based on this principle of subsidiarity and the idea that we want to encourage everyone to take as much responsibility as possible at the most local level possible, right? So take responsibility for yourself until you're good enough at that so you can take responsibility maybe for a wife. And then if you're good enough at that, maybe you can extend that to some kids. And then maybe you can serve your local community. And then maybe you can serve your state. And maybe if you really get good at it, you could serve your nation, right? But you're taking the responsibility. And here's the basic rule. All the responsibility you abdicate will be taken up by tyrants. That's the cardinal rule of social organization. And so we're trying to build out this story that's based on the deepest elements of Western tradition. That's an antidote to the false claim that it's only power that rules. Because top-down tyranny with fractionated individuals. And it's not utter chaos. It's ordered freedom. And that's what God tells Moses to tell the Pharaoh when he says, let my people go. Let my people go. No tyranny. So that they may celebrate me in the desert. It's ordered freedom. And it's the ordered freedom that comes along with being oriented towards the highest possible good. And so we're trying to work all that out now. We're going to have a conference in London October 31st, November 1st, and November 2nd.